Good evening. I'm Dr. Catherine Lewis, Professor of History at Kennesaw State University, and on behalf of the Marcus JCC and the National JCC Literary Consortium, I'm pleased to welcome you to this very special book fest in your living room event featuring best-selling author Andrew Lawler. We'll be discussing Andrew's exciting new book, Under Jerusalem, which takes us to the tombs, tunnels, and trenches of the Holy City, a saga of biblical treasures, intrepid explorers, and political upheaval. This evening's program is the Esther G. Levine Community Read, given to honor longtime Book Festival lay leader Esther Levine. Now, to get your copy of Under Jerusalem, please check your local JCC's website and independent booksellers. The book is also available from the official bookseller of the MJCCA and National JCC Consortium, Acapella Books. Now, I know you're going to have lots of questions for Andrew, so please use the Q&A feature in the bottom of your screen, and I will try to get to as many of them as possible. We respectfully ask that you don't put the questions in the chat, but use that Q&A feature. Now, to the main event. First, a little bit about our honored guest. Andrew Lawler is a best-selling author whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, and the Smithsonian. He's a contributing writer for science and a contributing editor for archaeology. Please welcome our very special guest, Andrew Lawler. Andrew, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you for joining us. I understand you're here in Atlanta.
Yes, I am. In fact, I'm in the attic of a friend of mine's house while my friends and family who live here in Atlanta are downstairs enjoying the show.
I love it. Well, nothing like Zoom to bring us all together. So
Exactly.
we've got a great conversation tonight. Andrew, I want to start with a question that I imagine many of our participants have, which is what was the impetus for the book?
Well, I've been covering Middle Eastern archaeology for a number of years, for about 20 years or so. And I'd visited most countries in the Middle East, including, of course, Israel, but I kind of steered clear of Jerusalem because I enjoyed writing about sites that were deep in the desert, that were these, beautiful mounds or tells where archaeologists were working from Lebanon to Afghanistan. But Jerusalem felt different because it was such a political place and so many religious issues there that I really tried to kind of keep my distance from it as long as I could. I did an occasional story, but for the most part, I steered clear for quite a long time.
Well, and it's always so interesting, and I know we're going to get to dig into this. So, how did you uncover the story? Talk just for a moment. I know this will come up as we go this evening, but just a little bit about the research process.
Well, it started when I went to a conference in Israel, and a friend of mine is an Israeli archaeologist named Israel Finkelstein, who's quite well known in Israel. He invited me to lunch and said, and let's go to lunch in Jerusalem, we'll take a walk. And since Israel is known for liking good food and wine, I thought we have a nice, long, leisurely lunch and then maybe take a stroll. Well, 6 hours after I met him, we were still underground, visiting all kinds of underground tunnels and tombs and places I did not know existed. And I thought I knew something about Jerusalem. And he introduced me to the archaeologists. And I was amazed by what was going on underground. And as we went through these various archaeological sites, I was noticing that the archaeologists were saying, oh, and if you look to your left, you'll see this tunnel that was dug in the 19th century by so-and-so, and this trench was dug by this Frenchman. And I wondered, who were these people that arrived in Jerusalem a century and a half ago? So that sent me to the archives to read up on the early archaeology. And then I realized more and more that there's this history that has been untold in Jerusalem. There are lots of books about the history of Jerusalem, and that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something fresh. I wanted to do a story about the people who came to dig, why they did it, and what impact it had on the city and on the world.
Well, and we see that wonderful photograph of you as we were getting started this evening. It looks like you're just about to go underground. Well, walk us through a bit of the story. It's a complex story, and I know we're not going to get to everything tonight, but I know you've got some amazing pictures and things to share with us. So
Yeah,
I'm going to mute my video and let's make that the main event for a moment.
fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. And let me take us into a little bit of a slideshow here. Bear with me while I share this for you all. And I'm hoping you can see it. So this is an image that was taken by my colleague, a photographer for National Geographic named Simon Norfolk. And I want to thank him because he provided me with a lot of these photos, most of which are unpublished, that were taken recently, right before the pandemic, during the 2 or 3 years that I spent going to and from Jerusalem. And first of all, for those of you who have not been there, and I'm sure a good number of the audience have visited Jerusalem, so this may be redundant, but it's important to understand where it is in order to understand why Jerusalem is so critical for understanding Middle Eastern and, in fact, world history. So we're coming down now. If you look at the satellite view, you'll see Egypt on the left and Mesopotamia or Iraq on the right. We're coming down, there's the Dead Sea, and now the Judean highlands, very rugged area, boom, right onto the city's Acropolis. And this is, to a large extent, at the center of the city. So it's a rectangular area that is called the Temple Mount by Jews and by Christians, and the Noble Sanctuary, or Haram al-Sharif, by Muslims. And this is within the Old City, which is the place where most of the important shrines exist. So why is Jerusalem so famous? I mean, after all, this is a city, as you saw, that's not on the coast. It's not on a major river. There's not really a major crossroads there. So how did Jerusalem become one of the most important cities in world history? And that's one thing that I was really curious about in digging into the past and the archaeological past of Jerusalem. Of course, you have Judaism, which considers this wall, the Western Wall, to be a sacred place. You have the Dome of the Rock to the right, which is on top of the Acropolis I mentioned. It's Islam's third holiest site. And it's also by tradition the place where the Jewish temples existed until the final destruction in 70 CE by the Romans. And then at the top right, just a 10-minute walk from these two sites that are right next to one another, is the Holy Sepulchre. And Simon Norfolk took this photograph. He was dangling from the cupola of the Holy Sepulchre, looking down at the traditional tomb of Christ right at Easter time. So aside from these three famous places, there are also countless shrines and tombs. Virtually every square inch of the old city is sacred. And let me give you a sense of the scale of this. Here's Central Park to the left, and then look at the reservoir in the center. You know, the old city to the right, which is that walled area, and if I use my cursor right here, it essentially could drop right into the reservoir. So this is a very, very small area indeed. Now, in writing about archaeology in the Middle East, one thing that seems to be common is that you have cities that are built of mud brick, and then the mud brick collapses or wears out, and you build another layer on top of that. So you get these large mounds. Well, Jerusalem is different, and this is really important to understand why the city has such an extensive subterranean life. So you'll see here the old city walls running along here. If you follow the cursor, here's Mount Moriah, or the city's Acropolis, Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif. And here's Mount Zion here. Here's the Eastern Hill with a spring. This spring is really important because it's the only continual source of water in Jerusalem. And combined with that, there's very little timber there, but there is a lot of stone because Jerusalem is built on limestone. It's very porous. And as a result, you get these springs that pop out of the sides of hills. Now, why this matters is that the rock is very unique because it's very soft to quarry. And when you bring it up above ground, it hardens and turns this beautiful golden hue that many of you have witnessed at sunset in Jerusalem. So as a result, people built from the beginning with stone. And to do that, you had to use arches. So as Charles Warren, an archaeologist we'll talk about in a moment, said, the Holy City never sleeps because you would build an arch, that would be your first floor, a vaulted room, and then later that might become a basement or become a cistern or even a cesspit, and you would build another room on top of that. So gradually you have these arches that rise in Jerusalem and the living cities above, but these spaces are below, being used in many different ways. And I'll give you an example. When I was living in the old city doing my research, I stayed in the Christian quarter and I found a grocery store that was nearby that had lots of good stuff. And one day the owner of the store, who was a Muslim shopkeeper, he said, "Who are you? You're hanging around here a lot. You're not a tourist." And I said, "No." And I told him what I was doing. And he laughed. And he walked over to the potato chip aisle, lifted up a hatch, and vanished right down it. I set my groceries down and I followed behind him. And when I stepped down below using my iPhone light, I was in this 13th century Crusader hall that was vast. My iPhone's light could not reach the end of it. And it was right next to the Holy Sepulchre. And I discovered there was this fascinating story of Coptic Egyptian monks who lived next door in the Holy Sepulchre who claimed this huge vaulted space. But the shopkeeper said, "No, hey, it's mine." And as a result, there was this 20-year incredible legal battle where you had Israeli Jewish judges and lawyers trying to adjudicate this complicated dispute between Muslims and Christians. And this is just the local grocery store. So it gives you an idea of the complexity beneath the city. All right, now I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the history of Jerusalem because others have done that. There are whole books you can read on this, but it is important to understand in order to get to the meat of what I became curious about while in Jerusalem. So you can think of the city as having 5 millennia with 3 distinct eras. The first is around 3000 BC. Now that's the time the first cities are being built in the Near East. And around this time, people are drawn to that spring I mentioned. Eventually a walled city is created. These are Bronze Age peoples. We don't know much about them. The Egyptian Empire eventually takes over a good portion of that part of the Middle East. And then eventually you have independent Canaanite kingdoms. And that's the status around 1000 BC or slightly after when the Israelites arrive. And this is what I call the Biblical Millennium. This is the millennium that most people know and are familiar with. The Judeans arrive, the Israelites arrive, they make Jerusalem their capital. And for the next 1,000 years, on and off, you have Assyrians and Babylonians and Greeks and Romans moving through this area, sometimes conquering, sometimes trading, often creating very stable, prosperous empires in which Jerusalem flourished. But in the end, in 70 CE, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in the middle of a civil war between Jews and also against Rome. Now, the Romans rebuilt the city as a completely different Western Roman city, in effect. Later, you had Persians who came in. Then the Romans converted to Christianity. They became what we call Byzantines. And then the Arabs arrived in the 7th century CE, bringing Islam. Now, later, as you all know, the Crusaders came in and wanted to take Jerusalem back for Christianity. And they succeeded for a century until they were thrown out. The Arabs come back. And then finally, around the early 1500s, around the time of Martin Luther in the West, the Ottoman Empire, Turkic Empire, takes over Jerusalem and that whole area. And the empire is based in Istanbul. And for the next 500 years, Jerusalem is under the firm control of the Ottoman Empire until 1917, in fact. So there you go, Jerusalem history in one slide. And I think I did that in 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, so now let's turn to what is so fascinating and so, I think, under-researched in terms of Jerusalem's history. And that is the race to rediscover and control biblical Jerusalem. Here's an image of the city back in the 19th century. The first guy to show up who got a dig permit was a French senator named Desauzy. Now, there were no archaeologists then. There were mainly wealthy European guys who wanted to go dig up treasure or find something interesting. And he did find something interesting. In a place called the Tomb of the Kings, the biggest tomb in Jerusalem, he discovered a sarcophagus. And in that sarcophagus were the remains of a woman, clearly royal, who was, according to him, a Judean queen dating back 1,500 years or so from the time of the Israelites and the early Judeans. Now, this sarcophagus was shipped to the Louvre, where it became a sensation, kind of like, think of the King Tut exhibit back in the 1970s, I guess it was, in the US. And it really generated large crowds of people eager to see the first real evidence of biblical history. Now, in doing so, he really infuriated the Jewish community, who viewed what this French Catholic was doing as simple grave robbery. This was desecration of the ancestors of the Jewish community. And in Europe, as well as in America, the Jewish communities were sending out protests. They were quite upset by this first effort at archaeology. But of course, the British were not going to let the French steal a march on them. The British really wanted, as the Americans wanted back in the 1960s, to beat the Russians in going to space and going to the moon. So the British wanted to beat the French when it came to getting and gathering biblical treasures. So the Palestine Exploration Fund was created to do this. And most of these people were actually British military officers. It was really a military effort. And in doing the digging underground that they did, and let me go to the next image here, and I'll give you here's a little video that that a friend of mine just took actually a few weeks ago in Jerusalem. So we're walking through part of what's called the Western Wall Tunnel. We'll talk about that later, but this will give you a sense. This was filled with sewage when a man named Charles Warren explored it. He had to actually build a little boat of doors in order to float along this really nasty, place. But Warren was an excellent cartographer and was able to really map what was underneath Jerusalem for the very first time. And these maps are still used today because he did extensive exploration. But in doing this, he also upset the Muslims. Just as the Jews have been upset by the Frenchmen, so the Muslims were upset by what Charles Warren did, because he was using gunpowder to blast his way through areas underground, shaking the houses above, and also, according to the people at the time, possibly endangering the noble sanctuary, the Temple Mount. So you can see that from the beginning, neither Jews nor Muslims really thought much of archaeologists, who were Westerners, Western Christians showing up, clearly looking for treasure. People really weren't sure what was going on. So in the 1890s, you have this search for the city of David. You've all heard of the city of David. That's the place where the Israelites, they conquered Jerusalem, and David and then his son Solomon beautified according to scripture. And it's the center of a small empire for a time, the United Kingdoms. And this was fascinating to, particularly to Protestants who really wanted to understand and find this site. The question was, where was the original Jerusalem? And its palaces and tombs and treasures and sacred artifacts, such as the Ark of the Covenant, shown here to the right, which, according to many legends, was hidden somewhere underneath Jerusalem. And then where was Solomon's tomb, pictured here in a fantastical image, painting done in the 19th century. So where was this stuff? Now, these two men, Bliss and Dickey, I never can tell which one is which. They both have droopy mustaches and look quite Victorian. But in any case, they dug here. Here's the old city in pink. They dug in this area of Mount Zion because that was rumored to be the place where the original Jerusalem was located. But then, finding nothing, they dug here on this little eastern hill. Remember that spring that's right there? And they finally found pottery which showed that this, in fact, was the oldest place in Jerusalem. So probably the city of David was there. But they found no palaces, no tombs, no treasure, no sacred artifacts. However, their find did attract a lot of attention in the West. And pretty soon you had treasure hunters arriving. And probably the craziest, zaniest expedition ever launched in Jerusalem was by a British aristocrat named Montague Brownlow Parker, who hooked up with this Finnish poet and theologian who believed he'd cracked the secret code in Ezekiel, in the chapter of the Bible that said exactly where the temple treasures, the Ark of the Covenant, and all that gold and silver that's mentioned in the Bible were hidden. Now, of course, they found nothing. They also neglected to hire an archaeologist, I should say. They had let's say, a Swiss psychic. They had a steamboat captain from the Congo. They had the guy who engineered the tube system in London. They did not have any good archaeologists on staff. Here's Parker down here. Now, when he failed to find the treasures, he got nervous, so he bribed the guard of the noble sanctuary, the Temple Mount, and at night went in 1911, went in and began to hammer away at the rock underneath the Dome of the Rock, the third holiest site in Islam, where Muhammad was said to have gone on a spiritual journey to heaven. And for many Jews, this was the place that was the most sacred part of the temple that the Romans had destroyed 2 millennia ago. This set off an incredible riot, which led to an international crisis. Now, Parker got away with his life. He was lucky. But at that point, the Muslims in that area realized that the Ottomans, based in Istanbul, could not protect this holy site. And some historians, such as Louis Fishman and Brooklyn College, believe that this was the beginning of Palestinian Arab nationalism, that we have to protect this holy site. And that set up a lot of what happened in the succeeding century. But first, I want to mention just briefly that there was a Jewish-Christian competition to find the Ark of the Covenant. Even though Parker didn't succeed, that didn't mean people didn't believe it was there. And Baron Rothschild was really upset because he didn't like the idea of Christians going to Jerusalem and digging up what he viewed as Jewish cultural heritage, much as the Jews back in de Saulcy's day in the 1860s had been upset with French Catholics trying to dig up the tombs of ancient Jews. So Rothschild put together an expedition and managed to do a lot of digging, but found some tombs, but no treasures, nothing that really could be traced to David or Solomon. And then, of course, you have the intervention of World War I, which stopped all digging. But the point here is that you have competition between the British and the French, between Germans and Russians, and other Europeans who were fighting to control not just what's under Jerusalem, but Jerusalem itself, because the Ottoman Empire was beginning to look shaky, and it was the great colonial prize of the 19th century. So politics is mixed in here. And now you have religion too, as the Jewish community in Europe begins to wake up and say, wait a second, Jerusalem is important for us too. Now, very quickly, I'll just say the 20th century was first part of the 20th century was a mess in Jerusalem. The British conquered it. Then later they gave it up because Arabs and Jews began to fight, particularly as Jewish immigration increased before, during, and after World War II and the Holocaust. And in the aftermath, of course, Israel was created and Jerusalem was divided, as Berlin would be a dozen years later, between Israel in the west and Jordan in the east. And Jordan controlled the old city. But that changed in 1967 with the Six-Day War, where Israel was able to assert control over all of Jerusalem, including the old city. So for the first time, Israeli archaeologists began to dig. And what did they find? Well, it's really fascinating because archaeologists can often find exactly what they think they're going after, and also they can find surprises that change our conception of history. And in this case, Benjamin Mazar, the man on the left, a very distinguished Israeli archaeologist, he was able to uncover large areas that showed the magnificence of Jerusalem back in the 1st century BC and AD, that is the time of Herod the Great and after, and until the Romans destroyed it in 70 CE. So for example, he was able to show that this next to the Temple Mount here, reconstructed at the order of Herod and by his successors, there was an enormous pedestrian interchange, the biggest pedestrian overpass, you could say, in the ancient world. So really able to show that, in fact, this had been a very important Judean city, not just based on what the text said, but physical evidence. So this had a political dimension because Israel at that time was arguing that that East Jerusalem was not occupied territory. It was actually part of Jerusalem and should be part of Israel. So this was physical evidence that was used to bolster that claim. Now, meanwhile, his colleague, Meir Ben Dov, the man in the blue shirt here, he began to dig on the south side of the Temple Mount, noble sanctuary. And of course, you have the Dome of the Rock here, Al-Aqsa Mosque, which were built in the 7th and 8th centuries, very early when the Muslims arrived. Now, the understanding by historians was that while Jews had considered Jerusalem very, very important, Muslims knew it was religiously important, but they didn't really give it much attention. Other than building these sacred buildings, there was not much politics, there wasn't much investment in the city. But Meir Ben Dov, who was an Israeli Jewish archaeologist, discovered a series of palaces, enormous structures with giant courtyards that dated to that very time, the early Muslim period. And this really changed the way historians thought about Jerusalem's development. But it also posed a threat to the Israeli claim to Jerusalem because it made it apparent that Muslims too had considered Jerusalem important. So when he talked to a colleague of his about his find, the colleague said, do you have a bulldozer? He said, yes. And his colleague said, bulldoze it, get rid of the evidence. Now, Ben Dov, as a good archaeologist, did no such thing. And in fact, went on that night to broadcast his find so there would be no damage to the site. But you can see here how politics and religion and science really are intertwined in complicated ways in Jerusalem. And now just a brief mention about the Rabbinic tunnel, the Western Wall tunnel, as many of you may know it. If you've been to Jerusalem, you probably have gone inside this. It's a tunnel that's built all the way down the length, you look down the length here, of the Western Wall, mostly under the Muslim quarter. Highly controversial, a really fantastic piece of engineering, but politically dynamite. This is the area that Warren had dug a century and a half earlier. Now, when this exit was opened at the far end on the Via Dolorosa, it created a huge outcry among Muslims who felt like their sector of the city was being invaded. So there were riots, 100 people died, thousands were injured, and really it set the stage for the end of the Oslo Peace Accords. It really poisoned the waters so that the Oslo peace process fell apart about the time that Bill Clinton left the White House. So again, you get an idea how just a tunnel in Jerusalem can affect world politics. There's another image of this incredible tunnel that runs the length of the foundation of the Western Wall. Now, the one thing that's happening now I'll mention is because there are many things going on in Jerusalem and I only have a few minutes, but I chose to focus on this particular site because it's the largest, most expensive, most complex, and also the most controversial of any archaeology dig in the world today. And what's the fuss? Well, during the Roman era, so that is around the time of Herod, the time of Jesus, the Romans, well, let's just say the assumption was it was Herod the Great who built a massive stairway, a monumental street that went from the bottom of that eastern hill that I showed you on the map a while ago, all the way up to the Temple Mount. And people had suspected it was there, but nobody had been able to access it because it was far underground. And in the intervening time, it's become a Muslim neighborhood. But in the 2010s, around 2013, work began to expose this street by digging a tunnel, kind of a subway tunnel, essentially, that can provide access for tourists and pilgrims to be able to walk up it on their way to the Temple Mount. Now, the assumption was this was built by Herod or one of his immediate successors. But the archaeology showed very clearly that it was Pontius Pilate, a man hated by both Jews and Christians as somebody who demeaned and did not respect Judaism. But in fact, it seems that he spent a good deal of time, effort, and money in beautifying Jerusalem and in actually building what was similar to what you had in Rome, a grand street that went up to the temple itself. So here again, archaeology provides us with a more subtle and interesting view of history that may go against the grain of some of our beliefs that we learned from Scripture. And this I'm just going to mention in one slide, the Govati Dig, which is across the street from what's known as the City of David National Park. It's a fantastic dig. They're digging down. They're able to access periods of Jerusalem's history where we have absolutely no evidence until now. The Persian era, when the Bible was probably largely written, very little evidence of its existence. Same with the Hellenistic time. when Hanukkah became a holiday. The story of Hanukkah took place during the Hellenistic era, but archaeologists had almost no physical evidence of this time. So for the first time, we're getting some really important data. And I'll mention that in Archaeology Magazine in the January issue, I've got a story about this dig. So if you're interested, just take a look, and we will move to what's going on upstairs. So you have this upstairs, downstairs in Jerusalem from the very beginning. This is not something new. It's something that has been happening since the first Western Christians arrived. So digging is today part of the conflict. Today, it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because you have patrons who are funding these very expensive digs who have strong political and religious agendas. You also have Palestinians, many of whom I visited, who complain that the digging is damaging their buildings, much as they did back in Charles Warren Day 150 years ago. And then there's a legal dispute over whether digging is legal at all in East Jerusalem, given that it is considered occupied territory by international law, and therefore digs are not permitted. Now, Israel argues that they've annexed East Jerusalem, it's part of Israel, and therefore it is not occupied. But again, these are conflicts that are happening above ground, including violent conflicts as well as legal conflicts, demonstrations that are in large part driven by what is underground, and more importantly, by the history of Jerusalem. Who owns that history? Who gets to tell the story? So to wrap up, to give you just a sense of what I discovered, and obviously I go into way more detail in the book, is that it was Western Christians who were looking for the biblical remains who helped fuel the rise of Zionism and helped create the Jewish interest in returning to Jerusalem. And as a result, that also set the stage for today's conflict. This string of events, which I never understood until I went to Jerusalem and talked with people and visited these sites and did the archival work. And there's also this challenge in Jerusalem that most people who are there, they go there because they want to see biblical Jerusalem. That draws media attention. When you dig for something, you find something biblical, it gets media attention, which in turn generates funding and political interest. And so this poses a lot of ethical issues for archaeologists who might be interested in the Neolithic, but they can't get the funding for that. So this is something that's rather unique to Jerusalem. There was a toilet that was discovered a month or two ago in Jerusalem. You can look it up online. I think it's a 2,700-year-old toilet. It got international headlines around the world. Why? Because it was in Jerusalem during the biblical era. So this is something that has made Jerusalem's archaeology so unique and problematic. And finally, and no one is going to tell you that they can offer a realistic solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a short talk, but I would say that a lot of the research that's going on in Jerusalem is giving us a more nuanced, and I would say a more accurate view of a city that is incredibly complex. And I think that this view could provide us with a way of moving beyond these very strict Jewish or Christian or Muslim narratives that are designed to assert ownership. That's fine. I don't criticize that, but I think that there's more that we can do to understand this city, because we want to understand why Jerusalem became the center of religious innovation, why it's so important to half the people or more on the planet. We want to get a picture of how people in Jerusalem lived, how they died, what they ate. We want that information. And I think as we get that information, some of these boundaries between these narratives will probably begin to dissolve over time. So that's it. I want to thank you. And of course, special thanks to National Geographic, which was very gracious in its funding, as well as the Society, photographer Simon Norfolk, who I mentioned, and Jerusalem's residents and the Israeli Antiquities Authority, which was extremely hospitable to me. They denied me nothing and allowed me access to anything I wanted. So I'm very grateful for the archaeologists who took time to speak with me over the years. And now I would be very happy to take questions, and also follow me on Facebook, visit my website, you know the routine.
Super. Oh, wonderful, Andrew. And I know we're going to have some questions. I think as people are sort of digesting all of that wonderful information, could you just say something about getting access to those tunnels? How much of it is available to the public? How much of it required a kind of special access for you as you were doing your research?
Well, it depends. The Western Wall Tunnel has been open to tourists for a good almost 20 years now, I think. But there are parts of it that are still under archaeological excavation and therefore not yet open to tourists. Eventually they will be. So there was one site that is probably was during the time of Herod the Great, was a council room, a very grand room, which is being excavated. There were actually two rooms with this enormous fountain in between and these columns that had lead piping where water would spurt out. And it was probably where the city council met or where they would wine and dine people. So that's something that likely will open in the near future. But there were sites like that were still under excavation that I was able to get access to. Many of these other places you can go to. The Western Wall Tunnel, most of it is open, although there are large parts of it that you can never quite know what's there. There's so many little tunnels and so many passageways and doors that you could spend years trying to really track it. And I hope that someday a researcher will be able to go and do 3D imaging and really give a sense of that 3D quality of Jerusalem. But that will be a major project.
Well, your contribution to the scholarship really is quite extraordinary. And I know many of the people on the call have already read the book or are certainly going to be inspired to do so. But I want to go to sort of our first question. Aran Elazar asks, do you have any sense of where the treasures of the Jewish temple might be? Is it still in Jerusalem?
Well, you know what I find more interesting? First, I'll say, I don't know. But what I find more interesting is why these treasures have obsessed people for so long. Because yes, there's this sacred quality to these, but what I was surprised by was it's drawn treasure hunters who have less, let's say, highfalutin motives, that they really want to bring this stuff home. In fact, that Parker expedition I mentioned in the early 19th century, they estimated these treasures would be worth something like, in today's dollars, $3 billion. Wow. So this is what pulled people. But so far, 150 years into this, there's really very little treasure, because the truth is that Jerusalem was destroyed, it was looted. It also was not anything like Rome or Babylon or Nineveh or Memphis or any of the other great cities of the Middle East. It was relatively a small city, even in its most prosperous times. So I think there was this assumption based on the biblical text that you would find massive treasure. But from the beginning, some archaeologists in Britain warned. They said, hey, this is a culture that doesn't believe in graven images. You're not going to find beautiful statues. So I think that they probably are not to be found.
There you are.
But hey, who am I to be a party pooper? There will be more who seek the Ark of the Covenant.
Indeed. Well, David Thurman says, I recently saw a documentary proposing the site of the ancient Hebrew temples, or at least Herod's temple, was not at the generally accepted Dome of the Rock site, but rather downhill in the ancient City of David area. What is known as the Western Wall, they argued, was part of a Roman garrison on the top of the hill. I'd be interested in whether you think that's a tenable hypothesis.
Wow, that's a fascinating question. So first of all, I will say that, and this is going to raise a lot of eyebrows, but Israeli archaeologists agree with this statement, and that is there is no physical evidence for the two Jewish temples. Now, that said, there is evidence for the Jewish temple complexes which existed. We don't really have anything from the Temple of Solomon that time, some stones, part of the walls around this great compound. But the time of Herod the Great, of course, there actually is some significant archaeological evidence of pieces of that complex. But the temple itself was one of many buildings, just as the Dome of the Rock is only one of a dozen or more buildings that exist today on top of the noble sanctuary. So where the temples were is a mystery, because the texts are not very clear and they're a little contradictory. People did not draw maps. We don't have a good map. And there's been not much archaeology done because this is a sacred site. And the Muslim clerics who control that area, they're not allowing digs because it's a sacred site to them, which is not terribly surprising. The Vatican probably does its own archaeology, but the Muslims aren't interested in doing that. So it's a mystery that is also has a political dimension. I'll just mention because there are a lot of people who want to rebuild the temple, which would involve possibly demolishing the Dome of the Rock. So this interest in
Right.
where the temple stood thousands of years ago, even that has a political dimension and religious dimension today, which is completely different from any other city in the world. Now, let me just mention the Romans. There is a big controversy about the Roman camp. Clearly, in the 1st century, 2nd century CE, there was a very large there was a legion stationed in Jerusalem, but it is unclear exactly where this legion was. Possibly on top of what was the Temple Mount, possibly in other parts of the city. We don't have enough evidence to say, and that's worth a whole chapter in and of itself, but I'll stop there.
There you go. And I want to invite again all of our participants to put your questions in the Q&A feature. And please don't be shy. Andrew's got a lot to share. But I know that Kenton Newton asked, could you comment on the Ethiopian monastery that's on the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Fascinating,
it's fascinating
story.
Yeah, so the roof of the whole, so every piece of the Holy Sepulchre is claimed by different Christian sects.
Right.
And the Ethiopians were part of the Coptic, the Egyptian Coptic sect. They broke away, I think, a century or so ago. But both the Copts as well as the Ethiopians have their chapels and their monasteries. They are on the roof of the Holy Sepulchre. And I went to visit the Copts as well as the Ethiopians. And it's fascinating, the stories. They talk about Helena, Empress Helena, who was the Byzantine empress who claimed to find the actual site of Jesus's resurrection and had found the true cross. I mean, they talk about her as if it was yesterday, and they point to her and they say, yes, and she gave us this part and that part, and we had this part, this really nice part of the Holy Sepulchre, but then because of politics, we were forced to give it up. And a lot of it is about how wealthy these sects are. And the wealthier you are, the more political power you could exert, and the better your position in the Holy Sepulchre. So the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholics have, a chunk. You have the Armenians, and then the smaller sects have little corners. In fact, when I visited the Holy Sepulchre, I talked for a long time with this Armenian archimandrite and the bishop, and we walked up to a column, and he pointed at the column and said, "You see that mark?" So I looked at it. It was a little mark. He said, "This side is ours. That side is the Greeks." So these spaces are jealously guarded, and the Ethiopians jealously guard their place on the roof, even if it is rather modest.
Indeed. Well, I'm working with the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, and one of the films that we are considering talks about the contested nature of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it's fascinating. It's literally contested inch by inch.
Yes.
Fascinating. Okay, so just again, reminding people to put their questions in, but I want to ask you something about how you start the book. And as a historian, it's always interesting how you begin, and you start with a timeline and a map, and talk about why you made that decision and what that does for readers.
Well, for me, it was because I was completely overwhelmed by Jerusalem's history. It's like a fire hose. There's so much. There are books written about the books written about Jerusalem. So in order for me to orient myself, I really needed to know, where is this place geographically? What is where? What is connected to what? And what happened when? So that gave me the grounding to be able to then start at what I consider to be the beginning of modern Jerusalem, which is 1863, when this French archaeologist arrives and begins to dig. And from that point on, I just follow it chronologically because it seemed so much easier to talk about 150 years than to try and swallow 5,000 years. And because I was interested in the creation of modern Jerusalem. And so really, it's those years that I'm focused on in between the 1860s and today. And of course, in between, you're getting the history of Jerusalem as the archaeologists are doing their work, and they're gradually uncovering bits and pieces. So you get to see that happen. But I think in a way that's, for me, it's a lot more palatable than trying to drink the fire hose of Jerusalem's history.
Right. Well, it's incredibly helpful, I think, to those who need that sort of broad context. So we have another question from Cheryl Heck, wondering, is the Kindle version of the book as good as the hardcover? Are they different in some ways?
Well, I haven't seen the Kindle version. I know that there's an Audible book that's out with a great, really great speaker. He did a really good job. But I would say that it's very helpful, and I assume the Kindle version will have the maps and the images, because I have lots of maps and lots of images, because the maps are so critical. Every chapter opens with a map of the old city that shows where the action in that chapter is happening, because again, Jerusalem is, even it's small, it's confusing. So this is a way to really orient the readers. And so I encourage you to look at both the book as well as the Kindle version, because they do have those. You miss out on that on the Audible book. But on the other hand, if you're driving, it's much safer to be listening than to be leafing through the book.
Absolutely. Well, Esther Levine, our beloved Esther Levine, asks, what happened to the sarcophagus that went to France in 1863?
Great question. And that was not planted. Esther just asked that on her own.
Good work, Esther.
I've got an article coming out in Biblical Archaeology Review and then in the winter issue that talks about this. And it's really important because it's a hot political topic right now between France and Israel. And that's because when this sarcophagus was found, taken to the Louvre, claimed to be a Judean queen, later it was clear, no, this is probably somebody who was buried in the 1st century, around the time of Jesus, a wealthy Jewish convert from Mesopotamia, from Iraq, actually. But more recently, a French monk has put forward a very interesting theory, and he's got some good data that shows that actually probably this woman was buried in the 3rd century, much later than people thought. And this tomb was actually built for Herod's grandson, for the last Judean king, but he died before it could be completed, and he wasn't buried there, and basically it was sold. So in the past few years, many Jews in Jerusalem have claimed that this is a sacred Jewish site, but since the late 19th century, it's been owned by France. It's actually French soil. And there's a great deal of controversy over how that transfer took place between a wealthy Jewish woman and the French state. And I go into some detail about this in the book. And so right now there's a suit against both the Louvre as well as the nation of France by a group of Israelis, a group of rabbis in particular, who believe that the sarcophagus and the remains should be brought back to Israel for burial. And it's been a major source of contention between the two countries. So we'll see what happens, but it's definitely still in the news 150 years later.
Absolutely. And I appreciate everybody putting in their questions. I'm going to try to get to everyone. And I know some of you've been follow-up questions. I'm not ignoring you. I just want to make sure I get through the first pass. And then if we have time, I'll come to the next. But one question, I'm not sure the name wasn't associated with it, but any measure of the length of the tunnels, any sense of how long they are?
Well, every tunnel is different. So you have tunnels, for example, that were built in the 8th century BCE. The Hezekiah tunnel is the most famous, that was built to take water. It goes thousands and thousands of feet. It runs underneath the city of David, or Wadi Hilwa, as Muslims call it today, that ends in the Pool of Siloam. So that was a tunnel built at that time. There were also tunnels that were built that aren't as long. They were built before then by Middle Bronze Age peoples. And then you have more modern tunnels. What's curious about Jerusalem is that tunneling was begun there because it was a living city and it was hard to dig a trench. But tunneling went out of fashion in archaeology because it's really considered a very poor way of doing science. Because if you dig straight down, you really are clear about what levels you can associate artifacts with architecture. But if you dig a tunnel, you can't see. It's like driving without peripheral vision. And so this new tunnel I mentioned that's being built now is very controversial because it's really goes against all our understanding of how to do archaeology today. But Israeli archaeologists argue it's the only way we know how to access the street. So it's amazing how many tunnels there are that stretch from Middle Bronze Age all the way up to this current tunnel. Some are thousands of feet long, some are just a few feet, some are several yards. Bliss and Dickey in the 1890s built this whole network of tunnels, some of which you can access now, some of which you can, are quite dangerous. And I'll also mention that the soil in Jerusalem is unique. It is made up of chips of limestone and bits of ruined buildings and quarries and what have you. And it has this odd property. It looks solid, but in a moment it can turn almost liquid. And so it's extremely dangerous to dig in this area. And so tunnels are quite dangerous, but people still build them.
There you go. Well, we have about 8 minutes left, and I know we've still got some great questions. Ed Gerson asks, what's the oldest artifact that has biblical documentation from that biblical period? I don't know if you can answer that specifically, but that was Ed's interest.
Yes. There is a seal. Well, there is some pottery that has on it a stamp, which is associated with early Judean rulers. Right. And it was found, actually, Charles Warren was the first to find this 150 years ago. They didn't recognize the significance of it. But more recently, Alat Nazar, a well-known Israeli archaeologist who just passed away in May, unfortunately, she found a number of these stamps which show that there was an administration. Now, the dating of this stuff is really difficult because if you don't have organic matter, even if you have organic matter that you could radiocarbon date, you can only get within maybe a century or two if you're lucky, if you have enough dates. But to just look at a piece of pottery, 3 archaeologists will have 3 different opinions of the age. So as far as I'd say the community of archaeologists go, there's nothing between the 1000 BC and say the 8th century BC that is not controversial. Anything found in that era, which is the era of David and Solomon, the early Judean rulers, is highly controversial because of this dating issue. Now, the archaeology is getting better, and in Jerusalem, they kind of avoided doing more modern archaeology, but now that's changing, and we have a lot more data coming in that should be able to nail this down. But really, one of the great mysteries is, where is the early city of David? There still is not a consensus on where this important era, where it actually existed.
Well, Andrew, I think what you've indicated is there's almost nothing that isn't controversial about Jerusalem, right? Well, Ezra asks, are they using any kind of imaging or anything like that to discover sites where you cannot dig?
That's a good question. Now, there certainly are new techniques, ground penetrating radar, for example, where you can tell what's below, but it depends on the soil. Some soils that's easy to do. Jerusalem, it's a little bit harder with limestone and with these caves and with this peculiar crumbly soil. It's a little more difficult. So at the same time, you also have different levels, different layers. So ground penetrating radar, which is the best way to do that, or satellite imagery, is great if you're out in a desert and there's been, say, just one period where people built stuff. But when you have the complexity of Jerusalem and what's on top of it, covering it, which are buildings that date back to, whether it's 10 years ago or 5 centuries ago, it makes it very difficult to see what's underground. So you're very limited in what you can do. You really have to dig.
Right, and it's complicated. Andrew, I want to make sure we get a chance to, and again, I know we've got some additional questions about the ladder with the Ethiopians, and is the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia? I know those are sometimes questions that you can't necessarily answer, but I do want you to talk for just a moment about what is the most surprising thing that you learned. It's certainly a rich and complex book. But was there anything, one thing that really stood out to you that was surprising?
Yeah, absolutely. It was that archaeology, or let's say the early Western Christian explorers, are the ones who really made Jerusalem a desirable place that people in the West wanted to go to as tourists, that explorers wanted to go dig to find things like the Ark of the Covenant, the temple treasures. And that, to my surprise, to a large extent helped inspire Zionism. And that I hadn't expected, because these Protestants were, particularly they were mostly Protestants, they were fascinated by the Old Testament, less interested really in Jesus, more interested in the prophets of old. And so again, their fixation or even obsession in many cases was what inspired many European Jews, including Theodor Herzl, who went to Jerusalem, visited the Tomb of the Kings. He went to archaeology lectures. I mean, we have the evidence, and I think I lay it out in the book, that shows that the early Zionists and people who wouldn't have called themselves Zionists were really inspired to look into their own cultural heritage, and also that this was a draw, that this would inspire Jews to want to return to Jerusalem, which at the time was not a place most Jews wanted to go, because it was a Muslim city. It was controlled by Muslims. It was a place where you would go to study, but it was not considered, it was kind of an old-fashioned place. And remember, a lot of Zionists were socialists who in many cases were atheists or agnostic, and were less interested in the religious history than they were in kind of the nationalist history of Judaism.
Well, and how history and archaeology can be used to sort of advance those arguments. My dear friend Tony Gallant, Tony, nice to see you on this, asks a question: what are they doing to prevent Jerusalem from collapsing? As you talk about the soil and the stone and the tunneling and the layer upon layer upon layer and the challenges that weather and weathering, all of those things. What are some strategies that the city is using?
Well, I'll give you one fun story. So one day I was walking down the street at Wadi Hill, where the city of David, above where that tunnel is, it's being built. And there had been a terrible rainstorm, and a giant pothole, a giant hole had opened up in the parking lot of the mosque that was above. And there was a cement truck from the city that had been sent. A contractor was told, go fill this hole. So as I stood there and watched, he opened the sluice gate and the concrete went down into this hole, but the hole didn't fill up. And he kept looking, and the concrete kept going in and in and in. And then I saw a guy down the hill run out from the tunnel and say, stop. What had happened was the soil had collapsed, and he was filling the very tunnel that they were building with.
Oh my gosh.
So, these are the kinds of things that happen all the time in Jerusalem. Now, I will say that one of the great problems that goes unmentioned is that most of the digging that goes on in Jerusalem is not done by Israeli archaeologists. It's done by the people who live in Jerusalem and who quietly, mostly Muslim, because they're mostly Muslims in the Muslim quarter, which is the largest quarter, they want a new basement, they have a new kid, so they want to build an additional room, they need more storage, so they dig down. Or in the case of a cafe I went to, he wanted to have more space to have a cafe, and he found a whole Crusader vaulting system behind his father's little store. And the problem there is that when you do this kind of digging, there are no archaeologists present, and these people don't want the Israelis to know they're doing it, because they could be fined heavily, they could go to jail. So this is a problem, because we're losing a lot of Jerusalem's cultural heritage without knowing what we're losing.
Of course, I can't even imagine. Well, I know as we're sort of coming to the end, but I want to thank everyone for their wonderful questions. I know we couldn't get everything answered, and so that's simply a plug for the book. You have to buy it and read it. So you can, but you've been incredibly generous, Andrew. But could you maybe give us, as we close out, a sense of your next project?
Oh dear. Well, gosh, I'm still trying to pull it together, but let's say the pandemic has inspired me to try and do something that doesn't involve getting on an airplane and traveling halfway across the world. So I'm hoping to focus on something a little closer to home. And the anniversary of the American Revolution is coming up. So
Right.
So we'll see. I'll come back and let you know in a couple of
We
weeks.
will stay tuned, but our special thanks to Andrew spending time with you, and of course to Esther, Levine, and all of you for joining us. We had over 120 people on the call on a rainy night in Atlanta. But there's so much more exciting book festival in your living room events ahead, including Sunday evening with the award-winning photographer Andrew Filer, and next week with best-selling fiction author Alice Hoffman. So please look at your JCC website for the most up-to-date schedule of events. But I will invite you to stay safe, to stay dry, stay healthy, and of course, stay tuned. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you again, Andrew.
Thank you.